She gave him everything: her savings, her home, her trust. And in return, her own son made her homeless. What would you do if the child you raised with love became the one who destroyed your life? This is the story of Margaret Hale, a mother who sacrificed everything, only to uncover a betrayal so carefully planned it took years to reveal. But what her son didn't expect was that she would fight back. Margaret Hale had spent her entire life believing in one simple idea: if you gave your family everything, they would never let you fall. At 68, she lived in a modest, sunlit home at the edge of a quiet town, a house she and her late husband had built together from nothing but savings, patience, and stubborn hope. Every wall held a memory. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon from years of baking. The hallway carried the echoes of footsteps that no longer existed, and the living room window framed the same maple tree her husband had planted decades ago. After he passed, the silence became heavier, but Margaret endured it the way she endured everything else in life, with quiet strength. For over 40 years, she had worked as a bookkeeper. Not glamorous work, not the kind that made headlines, but steady, reliable. She understood numbers, but more importantly, she understood discipline. Every dollar she earned had a purpose. She saved carefully, spent cautiously, and built a financial safety net she believed would protect her in old age. But if you asked Margaret what she was most proud of, she would never mention the money. She would say her son,
Andrew Hale,
her only child. She still remembered the day he was born, the way his tiny fingers curled around hers, the way she promised herself she would give him a better life than she ever had.
and she did.
Every school fee paid on time. Every birthday celebrated, even in years when money was tight. Every scraped knee comforted. Every late-night worry carried silently so he wouldn't have to. Andrew grew into a capable, intelligent man. At least, that's what Margaret believed. He had ambition, charm, and a way of speaking that made people trust him quickly. When he married Lily, Margaret welcomed her with open arms, even when something about the young woman felt distant. Not unkind, just hard to read. Still, Margaret told herself that love grows in different ways. Families take time. And if Andrew was happy, that was enough. In recent years, Andrew's visits had become less frequent. Phone calls shorter. Conversations more practical than warm. But Margaret never complained. She understood that life gets busy. Careers, responsibilities, marriages, they all pull people in different directions. And besides, she trusted him.
Completely.
On quiet evenings, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the fading light, and think about the future. Not with fear, but with a gentle sense of certainty. She had done everything right. She had raised her son with love. She had built a stable life. She had prepared for whatever came next. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the very person she trusted most had already begun rewriting her future. Not with sudden cruelty, but with patience. Careful, quiet, and almost invisible. The kind of betrayal that doesn't arrive all at once but grows slowly, beneath the surface, until it's too late to stop. At first, the changes in Andrew's life seemed small, easy to explain, easy to forgive. Margaret noticed it during one of their weekly phone calls. His voice sounded tired. Not the ordinary kind of tired that comes from long days at work, but something deeper.
Strained.
Distracted. Like his mind was always somewhere else, even when he was speaking to her. "Work's been a little rough lately," he said one evening, his tone light but not quite convincing. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea. "What kind of rough?" she asked gently. "Oh, business stuff," he replied quickly. "Just temporary."
Temporary.
It was a word Margaret wanted to believe. Over the next few weeks, those small hints began to form a pattern. Andrew called more often, but not to chat the way he used to. The conversations felt heavier. Less about sharing, more about explaining. Deadlines. Clients pulling out. Unexpected expenses. And always, just beneath the surface, something unspoken. Lily began appearing more frequently in the background of those calls. At first, she stayed quiet, her voice distant, occasionally offering a polite greeting. But gradually, she became more involved. "You know how stressful it's been for him," she said one evening, her tone calm but pointed. "He doesn't like to worry you." Margaret felt a small tightening in her chest. "I'm his mother," she replied softly. "I'd rather know than be kept in the dark." There was a brief silence. Then Lily spoke again, this time more carefully. "We're just trying to handle things on our own." It sounded responsible. It sounded mature. But something about it left Margaret uneasy. A few days later, Andrew came to visit in person. That alone was unusual. He hadn't dropped by without notice in years. Margaret was in the garden when she saw his car pull into the driveway. For a moment, her heart lifted with a quiet, familiar joy. "He's here," she thought. But when he stepped out of the car, that feeling shifted. He looked different. Still well-dressed, still composed, but there was tension in his posture, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile as he walked toward her. She wiped her hands on her apron and hugged him. "You should have called," she said. "I would have made lunch." "This won't take long," he replied. Something in the way he said it made her pause. They sat down in the living room. For a few moments, Andrew said nothing. He looked around the house instead, his gaze lingering on the walls, the furniture, the small details that had been part of his life for decades. Then he exhaled slowly. "I've hit a bit of a situation," he admitted. Margaret didn't interrupt. She waited. "There were some investments," he continued. "They didn't go the way I expected. And now things are a little tight." A little tight. Margaret had lived long enough to know that people only used gentle words when the truth was harder. "How tight?" she asked quietly. Andrew hesitated. Then he gave a number. Margaret felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't just a setback. It was a crisis. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Andrew leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. "I didn't want to come to you," he said. "I really didn't. But I don't have many options left." Margaret looked at her son. Not the man sitting in front of her, but the boy he used to be. The one who ran into her arms after school. The one who trusted her to fix everything. And in that moment, something inside her made a decision before her mind could catch up. Because to Margaret, he was still that boy. And she would never let him fall. Margaret didn't make her decision all at once. It happened quietly, over the course of several days, woven into small thoughts, restless nights, and long moments of silence where she sat alone with her memories. The number Andrew had told her stayed in her mind. It followed her into the kitchen while she prepared breakfast. It sat with her in the living room as the evening light faded. It lingered even in the quiet hours of the night, when sleep refused to come. She knew what it meant. This wasn't something he could solve on his own. And more importantly, he had come to her. That mattered. Margaret had always believed that when a child reaches out for help, you don't measure the cost first. You respond. 2 days later, she called him. "Come by this afternoon," she said gently. "We'll figure this out." Andrew arrived with Lily this time. Margaret noticed that immediately. Lily stepped into the house with a polite smile, her eyes scanning the room in a way that felt almost assessing. Not openly critical, not rude, but observant. Careful. "You have such a lovely home," she said. Margaret smiled faintly. "Thank you." They sat together at the dining table, the same table Margaret and her husband had shared for decades. The same table where Andrew had done his homework as a boy, where birthdays had been celebrated, where countless ordinary days had quietly built a life. Now it felt different, heavier. Margaret folded her hands in front of her. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she began. Andrew shifted slightly in his chair. "I don't want you to feel pressured, Mom," he said quickly. "We'll find another way if—" "There is no other way," Lily interrupted softly. The words were calm, but firm. Margaret glanced at her, surprised. Lily held her gaze for a moment, then added more gently, "We've tried everything." There was a silence that followed. Margaret turned back to her son. "How much do you need?" she asked. Andrew hesitated again, as if saying the number out loud still felt heavy. When he repeated it, it didn't sound any smaller. Margaret nodded slowly. "I can help," she said. Andrew's head lifted. "Are you sure?" he asked. She gave a small smile. I didn't spend 40 years saving just to watch my son lose everything. Relief washed over his face. Real, visible relief. And for a moment, that alone made everything feel worth it. The process moved faster than Margaret expected. Within a week, she had withdrawn a large portion of her savings. Years of careful discipline. Years of saying no to things she didn't need. Years of planning for a future that now felt uncertain. She paid off Andrew's debts. All of them. When the final transfer was completed, Andrew hugged her tightly. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment. "You already have," she replied softly. But it didn't end there. A few days later, Andrew brought something else up. They were sitting in the living room, the late afternoon sun stretching across the floor. "There's just one more thing," he said carefully. Margaret looked at him. "What is it?" He glanced briefly toward Lily, who was sitting quietly nearby. Then he continued. "The house," he said. "It would actually help a lot if it was in my name." Margaret frowned slightly. "In your name?" "Just for security," he added quickly. "It makes things easier with the bank. Temporary. Until everything stabilizes." Lily nodded. "It's just paperwork," she said smoothly. "Nothing really changes. Nothing really changes." Margaret repeated the phrase silently in her mind. She looked around the room. At the walls her husband had painted. At the window where she had spent countless quiet evenings. At the life she had built. Then she looked back at her son. And once again she chose him. "All right," she said. She didn't realize it yet. But in that moment, she had just given away the last thing she truly owned. At first, Margaret told herself everything felt normal again. Andrew called more often. That alone brought her comfort. "Just checking in," he would say, his voice lighter now, almost like before. "Making sure you're okay." And she believed him. She wanted to believe him. But slowly, so slowly she almost didn't notice, something began to change. It started with small things. Andrew stopped visiting in person. Not completely, but enough that the house felt quieter than it used to. When he did come by, it was brief. Always with a reason. Always with somewhere else he needed to be. "I've got meetings," he would say, already glancing at his phone. Lily rarely came at all anymore. When she did, she remained polite, always polite but distant. Her smiles never lingered, her conversations never deepened. She moved through the house like a guest, not like someone connected to it. Margaret noticed.
Of course she did.
But she told herself not to read too much into it. Young people are busy, she thought. Life moves faster for them. Then came the phone calls. They grew shorter, more efficient, less like conversations, more like updates. "Everything's going well," Andrew would say. "Things are stabilizing. We're almost back on track." Margaret would listen, nodding even though he couldn't see her. "That's good," she would reply softly. But sometimes after the call ended, she would sit there a little longer than usual, staring at the silent phone in her hand. Because something felt missing. Not words. Not information. Something deeper. One afternoon, she decided to visit them instead. It had been weeks. Too long in her mind. She brought a homemade pie, the same apple pie Andrew had loved since he was a boy. She wrapped it carefully, the way she always did, and drove to their house without calling first. A small surprise. That's all she intended. When she arrived, the house looked the same.
Neat.
Quiet. Almost too quiet. She knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. Just as she was about to leave, she noticed something that made her pause. The curtains in the front window shifted. Just slightly. Someone was inside. Margaret frowned. She knocked one more time. This time, footsteps approached. The door opened. Lily stood there. "Oh," she said, clearly surprised. "Margaret." Margaret smiled gently, holding up the pie. "I was in the area," she said. "Thought I'd stop by." Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. "Of course," she said.
Come in."
Inside, the air felt different. Not unwelcoming, but not warm either. Margaret stepped into the living room, her eyes instinctively scanning the space. Something had changed. She couldn't immediately say what. but she felt it. Andrew's not home, Lily said casually. He's out. I can wait, Margaret replied. Lily gave a small, polite smile. He might be a while. The words hung there. Not rude, not direct, but clear enough. Margaret slowly set the pie down on the kitchen counter. I won't stay long then, she said. On her way out, she glanced back once more. At the house. At the space that now, somehow, felt less familiar, less connected. As she drove home, a quiet thought settled into her mind. Not loud, not sharp, just present. Something isn't right. But like every time before, she pushed it away, because doubt, to Margaret, felt far more frightening than trust. The day everything fell apart didn't begin with anything unusual. It was a quiet morning, the kind Margaret had grown used to. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, landing softly across the kitchen floor. She moved through her routine slowly, coffee, a piece of toast, the familiar hum of silence filling the house. There was comfort in that routine. Stability. At least, that's what she believed. Around mid-morning, she decided to go out for a short walk. The air was cool, the sky clear, and for a moment, everything felt almost peaceful. She locked the front door behind her, the same way she had done for years. Nothing seemed out of place. When she returned an hour later, the first thing she noticed was the car in the driveway. It wasn't Andrew's. It wasn't anyone she recognized. Margaret slowed her steps slightly, a small ripple of confusion passing through her. Maybe a visitor, she thought. Maybe Andrew had come by. But as she got closer, that explanation began to unravel. The front door was open, not wide, just slightly. Enough to make her stop. A strange feeling crept into her chest. Margaret stepped forward carefully and pushed the door open. Hello, she called out. No answer. She stepped inside and froze. The living room looked wrong. Not messy, not damaged, just different. The furniture had been rearranged. Her armchair, her chair, was gone. The small table beside it had been replaced. Even the photographs on the wall were missing. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. What? She whispered. Footsteps echoed from the hallway. A man she had never seen before appeared, holding a clipboard. He looked just as surprised to see her. Ma'am, he said. Can I help you? Margaret stared at him. This is my house, she said slowly. The man hesitated. Then his expression shifted, awkward, uncertain. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he replied carefully. This property was sold last week. The words didn't make sense. Margaret blinked. Sold, she repeated. Yes, he said. We just closed. We're preparing for the new owners. New owners. The phrase echoed in her mind, hollow and distant. That's not possible, she said, her voice trembling slightly now. My son. At that moment, another voice came from behind her.
Mom.
Margaret turned. A woman stood at the doorway, holding a folder. We're with the real estate company, she explained gently. Are you?
Margaret Hale.
Margaret nodded slowly. The woman's expression softened. Oh, she said quietly. That single word carried everything Margaret needed to understand. Her hands began to shake. No, Margaret said, almost to herself. No, there must be a mistake. The woman hesitated, then opened the folder. The property was transferred into Andrew Hale's name, she said carefully. And he authorized the sale 3 days ago. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. He wouldn't do that, she whispered. But even as she said it, something deep inside her already knew. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers and dialed Andrew's number. It rang.
And rang. And rang.
No answer. She tried again. Voicemail. Her chest tightened. Please, she whispered into the phone. Andrew, call me back. Minutes passed. Or maybe longer. Time felt distorted. The strangers in her house continued moving around her, speaking quietly, avoiding her eyes. Eventually, the woman stepped closer. I'm so sorry, she said gently. But legally, this property no longer belongs to you. Legally. The word landed like a final blow. Margaret stood there in the middle of the room she had built, the room that had held her entire life, and realized something she had never imagined possible. She had nowhere to go. No home. No warning.
No explanation.
Just silence. And the unbearable truth that her own son had disappeared, taking everything with him. Margaret didn't remember how she left the house. One moment she was standing in the living room, surrounded by strangers and unfamiliar furniture, and the next, she was outside, sitting in her car with her hands resting on the steering wheel. The engine wasn't on. The world around her felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. She stared straight ahead, her mind trying to catch up with what had just happened, but the thoughts refused to form properly. Everything felt distant, like she was watching someone else's life unfold instead of her own.
Sold.
The word echoed again.
Sold.
Not lost. Not taken.
Sold.
By her own son. Her phone sat in her lap. She picked it up again, her fingers trembling as she dialed Andrew's number for the third time. Straight to voicemail. Andrew, her voice cracked slightly. Please call me. There's been some kind of mistake. But even as she said it, the truth pressed harder against her chest. There was no mistake. Hours passed before she finally started the car. She didn't know where she was going. She just drove. Through familiar streets that suddenly felt unfamiliar. Past places she had known for decades, shops, sidewalks, quiet corners of the town, and yet none of it felt like it belonged to her anymore. Because home wasn't just a place. And hers was gone. By late afternoon, reality began to settle in. She had nowhere to stay. No plan. No warning. Margaret parked outside a small grocery store and sat there for a long time, watching people come and go. Families. Couples. Ordinary lives continuing as if nothing had changed. She felt invisible among them, as if her entire existence had quietly slipped out of place. Eventually, she called the only person she could think of. A former colleague, Helen. They hadn't spoken in months, but Helen answered on the second ring. Margaret, she said, surprised. Is everything all right? Margaret opened her mouth. For a moment, no words came out. Then, softly, I need somewhere to stay. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough for Margaret to feel it. Of course, Helen said quickly. Come over. We'll figure it out. That night, Margaret slept in a guest room that wasn't hers. The bed was comfortable. The blankets were warm. But nothing felt right. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's house. And for the first time in her life, she felt truly displaced. Not just physically, but emotionally. As if something fundamental inside her had been removed. In the days that followed, the reality became impossible to ignore. Her belongings were gone. Her access to the house, legally gone. Her savings, mostly gone. Everything she had built over decades had vanished in a matter of days. And Andrew, still nothing. No calls. No messages.
No explanation.
It was as if he had erased himself from her life completely. Grief came, but not the kind she expected. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, heavy, a constant weight that sat in her chest and refused to move. Because this wasn't just loss. This was betrayal. And betrayal, Margaret realized, didn't break you all at once. It hollowed you out slowly, until you barely recognized what was left. One evening, sitting alone in Helen's living room, Margaret finally allowed herself to say the words she had been avoiding. He knew, she whispered. Helen looked at her. Knew what? Margaret's eyes filled, but her voice remained steady. He knew exactly what he was doing. And, in that moment, something inside her shifted. Not healed, not yet, but awakened. Because beneath the pain, something else had begun to form. Something stronger than grief. Something sharper than sadness. The beginning of a question she had never asked before.
Why?
The first real crack in the story didn't come from Andrew. It came from a lawyer. 3 days after Margaret left her house for the last time, Helen insisted on taking her to a small legal office downtown. You need answers, Helen said firmly. And right now you don't have any. Margaret didn't argue. She was too tired to resist. The office was quiet, lined with shelves of neatly organized files and the faint smell of paper and coffee. It felt structured, predictable, the opposite of her life now. A man in his early 50s greeted them. "Mrs. Hale," he said, offering a polite handshake. "I'm Daniel Mercer. Please have a seat." Margaret sat slowly, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the lawyer opened a file. "I've reviewed the basic information you provided over the phone," he said. "And I'm going to be very direct with you." Margaret nodded faintly. "All right." He looked at her carefully. This was not sudden. The words landed quietly, but heavily. Margaret frowned. "I don't understand." Mr. Mercer slid a document across the desk. "The property transfer," he said. "You signed it several weeks ago." Margaret stared at the paper. Her name was there. Her signature.
Clear.
Undeniable. Her chest tightened. I remember signing something," she said slowly. "But Andrew said it was just temporary. For the bank." The lawyer nodded. "Yes," he said. "That's how it was presented to you." There was a pause. Then he added, more carefully, "But legally, it was a full transfer of ownership." Margaret's fingers curled slightly against her lap. "So, he owned the house," she whispered. "Yes." "And he could sell it?" "Yes." The room felt colder. Not physically, but in a way Margaret couldn't explain. "Then it's my fault," she said quietly. "No," the lawyer said immediately. Margaret looked up. "This situation is more complicated than that." He opened another file. "There are multiple transactions tied to your son's accounts," he explained. "Large ones. Over the past year." Margaret blinked.
A year?
He nodded. "Possibly longer." Something inside her stilled. Not panic. Not grief. Something sharper.
"Show me," she said.
He turned the file toward her. Numbers.
Dates.
Transfers. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pages. At first, they didn't make sense. But then, they did. Because Margaret understood numbers better than most people. And what she saw wasn't chaos. It was structure, patterns, intent. "These," she murmured, pointing to a series of transactions. "These aren't random." "No," Mr. Mercer agreed. Margaret's voice grew steadier. "They're staged." The lawyer didn't respond immediately, because he didn't need to. Margaret sat back slowly. Her mind was no longer clouded. It was clear, painfully clear. "He didn't come to me because he was desperate," she said. No one interrupted her. He came because he was ready. Helen shifted beside her. "Margaret." But Margaret shook her head slightly. Her eyes were still fixed on the documents. "He knew exactly how much I had," she continued quietly. "He knew what I would do." Her hands stopped trembling. "They planned this." Silence filled the room. Not empty, but heavy with understanding. Mr. Mercer finally spoke again. "There's more," he said. Margaret looked up. "The sale of the house was completed unusually fast," he explained. "Cash buyer. Prearranged." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Of course. It wasn't a last-minute decision. It was the final step. When she opened her eyes again, something had changed. The confusion was gone. The denial was gone. Even the grief had shifted. What remained was something colder, stronger. "They didn't just betray me," she said quietly. She looked at the lawyer. "They built this." And for the first time since everything fell apart, Margaret wasn't asking what happened anymore. She already knew. Now, she wanted to know how far it went. Margaret didn't go home that day. Not because she didn't want to, but because she no longer had one. Instead, she sat in the lawyer's office longer than necessary, her eyes fixed on the documents spread across the desk. Numbers, dates, signatures, they no longer looked confusing. They looked deliberate. Carefully placed pieces in something much larger than she had imagined. "Can we trace everything?" she asked quietly. Mr. Mercer nodded.
"We can try," he said.
"But it will take time." "I have time," Margaret replied. What she didn't say was, she had nothing else left. The investigation began slowly. At first, It felt like trying to follow footprints in the dark. But the deeper they went, the clearer the path became. And what they uncovered was worse than betrayal. It was design. Andrew's financial trouble hadn't started recently. It went back years. Bad investments, risky decisions, mounting debt hidden behind polished words and confident smiles. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was how he responded to it. He didn't panic, Mr. Mercer explained during one of their meetings. He adapted. Margaret sat across from him, listening in silence. He consolidated accounts, the lawyer continued. Moved money strategically. Reduced visibility. Margaret's jaw tightened slightly.
He was preparing, she said.
Yes. But Andrew hadn't done it alone. Lily's name appeared more and more often. Joint accounts. Shared decisions. Co-signed documents. She was involved from the beginning, Margaret murmured. Mr. Mercer didn't disagree. As the weeks passed, the pattern became undeniable. Andrew hadn't suddenly come to his mother in desperation. He had approached her at the exact moment he needed her most vulnerable, when she still trusted him completely, when she would say yes without hesitation. Margaret remembered that day in the living room, his voice, his hesitation, the way he looked at her, not like a son asking for help, but like someone waiting for a door to open. And she had opened it, willingly. They studied you, Mr. Mercer said carefully. Margaret looked up. What do you mean? They knew your habits, he explained. Your finances. Your emotional responses. Margaret's chest felt tight, but her expression remained steady. They knew I would help, she said. Yes. Another document slid across the desk. This one made her pause. A timeline. Not official, but reconstructed. Dates of financial stress. Dates of conversations. Dates of transfers. And right in the middle, the day Andrew came to her house. Margaret stared at it for a long time. It wasn't random. None of it was. He didn't come to me because he had no choice, she said quietly. No, Mr. Mercer replied. Margaret's voice dropped lower. He came because it was time. And then came the final piece. Travel records. Andrew and Lily had left the country 2 days after selling the house. Not in a hurry, not in panic, but with tickets booked weeks in advance. Margaret let out a slow breath. Of course, this wasn't an escape. It was an exit. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Margaret spoke again. They thought I wouldn't fight back, she said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Mercer studied her carefully. Most people in your position don't, he said. Margaret nodded faintly. That made sense.
Grief. Shock. Age.
All the reasons people stayed quiet. But something inside her had already changed. The woman who sat in that chair now was not the same one who had signed those papers. Not the same one who believed trust was enough. Margaret straightened slightly. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm.
Clear.
Decisive. Then they made a mistake. Mr. Mercer raised an eyebrow. Margaret met his gaze. They thought this was the end of the story, she said. A brief pause. Then, it's not. Margaret didn't rush into action. That surprised even her. Because for most of her life, when something went wrong, she responded immediately, fixing, adjusting, giving. That was who she had always been. But this time, she waited. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. They've already planned their moves, she said one morning, sitting across from Mr. Mercer. If I react too quickly, I'll just be following them. The lawyer studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. That's correct. Margaret folded her hands calmly. Then we do this properly. The first step was gathering evidence. Not just emotional truth. Legal truth. Every transaction was documented. Every signature examined. Every timeline reconstructed with precision. Margaret sat through it all, page after page, detail after detail, never once asking them to stop. Because now, she needed to see everything. Not as a mother, but as someone who had been deceived. They exploited trust, Mr. Mercer explained. That gives us grounds. Margaret nodded. And the transfer? Questionable, he said. especially if we can prove misrepresentation. Misrepresentation. The word settled firmly in her mind. Andrew hadn't just asked. He had framed it, softened it, guided her into a decision she didn't fully understand. That was when Margaret made her decision. "We file a case," she said. Mr. Mercer didn't hesitate. "I'll begin immediately." The legal process was not simple. It moved slowly, deliberately, but Margaret stayed with it. Every step, every meeting, every document. They traced Andrew's accounts across borders. Multiple transfers, layered transactions. Funds moved through different channels to make them harder to follow. But not impossible. Not when someone was patient. They underestimated one thing, Mr. Mercer said during one of their sessions. Margaret looked up.
"What?"
"You." At first, Margaret didn't respond. But later that night, sitting alone in Helen's guest room, she thought about it. For decades, she had been seen as predictable,
Kind. Giving.
safe. And all of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Margaret Hale had spent 40 years working with numbers, tracking them, understanding them, finding what didn't belong. And now, for the first time, she was applying that same precision to her own life. Weeks turned into months. The case grew stronger. Evidence expanded. And slowly, authorities became involved. Not just local, international. Because Andrew and Lily hadn't just left. They had relocated.
Carefully.
Strategically, but not invisibly. One afternoon, Mr. Mercer called her. His voice was steady, but there was something different in it. "We've located them," he said. Margaret's heart didn't race.
She didn't gasp.
She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Where?" she asked. He told her. Another country. Far enough to feel safe, but not beyond reach. "They've been living under their own names," he added. "That helps us." Margaret nodded slowly.
Of course it did.
Because people like Andrew didn't think they would be chased. They thought they had finished the story. But they hadn't. "Next up?" Margaret asked. Mr. Mercer leaned forward slightly. "We escalate," he said.
Fraud.
Financial exploitation. Cross-border cooperation. Margaret held his gaze. "Do it." There was no hesitation in her voice. No doubt. No fear. Because this was no longer about money, or property, or even betrayal. This was about truth. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Margaret wasn't reacting to what had been done to her. She was moving forward, with intention, with clarity, and with something her son had never expected her to have, the will to fight back. The call came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Margaret was sitting by the window, a notebook open in front of her, reviewing documents the way she had done every day for the past few months. Numbers.
Dates.
Details. Control. That was what she had rebuilt.
Her phone rang.
She glanced at the screen. "Mr. Mercer." She answered immediately. "Yes." There was a brief pause. Then, "They've been detained." Margaret didn't speak. Not right away. The words settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place. "Where?" she asked. "At the airport," he replied. They were preparing to travel again. Authorities intercepted them before departure. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Not in relief. Not in triumph. Just stillness. The process that followed moved faster than she expected. Once authorities were involved, everything shifted. What had once been a quiet investigation became official. Documented.
Public.
Charges were filed.
Fraud.
Financial exploitation.
Forgery.
Cross-border asset manipulation. Words Margaret had never imagined would be connected to her own family. She attended the hearings.
Not because she had to, but because she chose to.
The courtroom was colder than she expected. Not in temperature, in atmosphere. Everything there felt stripped of emotion. Reduced to facts. Evidence. Arguments. Andrew sat across the room. For the first time in months, Margaret saw her son again. But something was different. Not just the situation. Him. He looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence. The confidence she remembered, the easy charm, the controlled composure, was gone. In its place was something tighter, more fragile. Their eyes met once. Just once. Margaret didn't look away. Neither did he. But whatever connection had existed between them before was gone. Lily sat beside him, composed as always. But even she couldn't fully hide the tension now. The control had slipped. The evidence spoke clearly. Too clearly. The timeline, the transfers, the property sale, the coordinated exit from the country. Even the documents Margaret had signed, presented alongside expert testimony explaining how they had been framed, simplified, and misrepresented. They understood exactly what they were doing, the prosecutor said. Margaret listened, quietly. There was no dramatic moment.
No sudden confession. No emotional breakdown.
Just facts, layered carefully, until denial was no longer possible. When the verdict came, the room remained still. Andrew and Lily were found guilty. Sentenced. Margaret didn't react immediately. She sat there, her hands resting calmly in her lap, as the weight of it settled. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Something more complicated. Because justice, she realized, didn't feel the way people imagined. It didn't erase what had happened. It didn't restore what was lost. It simply acknowledged the truth. As Andrew was led away, he turned once more.
Just briefly, as if he wanted to say something.
But he didn't. Margaret watched him go. Her son, the boy she had raised, the man who had betrayed her. And for the first time, she didn't feel confusion, or denial, or even anger. She felt clarity. Because the story she had once believed, about love, trust, and family, had ended. And, in its place, something else had begun, not defined by what she lost, but by what she had faced and survived. The silence after the trial felt different from the silence that came before. Before, it had been heavy. Now it was open. Margaret didn't return to her old house. She couldn't. Not because she wasn't allowed, but because she chose not to. Some places, she realized, carried too much of what was lost, and she no longer needed to hold on to that. Instead, she moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't large. It wasn't impressive, but it was hers. Completely. The first night there, she stood in the middle of the empty living room, holding a single box of her belongings. A few clothes, some photographs, a handful of books. That was all that remained. Years of her life, reduced to what could fit into boxes. But strangely, she didn't feel broken. Not the way she once had. She set the box down slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the street was quiet. A few lights glowed in nearby homes. Ordinary life. Uncomplicated. Margaret rested her hand lightly against the glass. For the first time in a long time, she asked herself a different question. Not what did I lose, but what do I still have? The answer surprised her. She had her mind, clearer now than it had been in years. She had her independence, hard-earned and no longer given away. And she had something she had never fully claimed before. Her own boundaries. The days that followed were simple, deliberately so. She woke up early, made her own coffee, walked through the neighborhood without rushing, no longer waiting for phone calls that never came, no longer adjusting her life around someone else's needs. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar. Then, it became peaceful. Margaret found small routines again. Grocery shopping, reading in the afternoons, writing notes to herself, lists, thoughts, reminders. Not because she needed to, but because it grounded her. She also began meeting with a financial advisor.
Carefully, cautiously.
This time, she asked questions. Every detail, every condition. She no longer assumed trust. She built it. And slowly, something began to return. Not the life she had before, but something new. One afternoon, Helen visited. They sat together at the small kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the surface. You seem different, Helen said gently. Margaret smiled faintly. I am. Helen studied her. In a good way? Margaret considered the question, then nodded. Yes. There was a pause. Then Helen asked softly, "Do you ever think about them?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands. Steady now. No longer trembling. "Sometimes," she said. "Does it still hurt?" Margaret exhaled slowly. Not the same way. And that was the truth. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. It no longer controlled her. It no longer defined her. Because Margaret had learned something she never expected to learn at this stage of her life. That strength doesn't come from never being broken. It comes from rebuilding differently. That evening, after Helen left, Margaret sat alone in her apartment. The air was quiet.
Calm.
She looked around the room. At the simplicity. At the absence of everything she once thought she needed. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she had lost her life. She felt like she had taken it back. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. Margaret had just returned from the market, a small paper bag of groceries resting against her hip as she walked slowly up the steps to her apartment. The air carried the faint scent of rain, and the sky was beginning to soften into evening. Nothing about the moment felt remarkable, until she saw the letter. It was tucked neatly beneath her door. No return address. Just her name, written carefully across the front. Margaret paused. For a brief second, an old instinct stirred. Hesitation, caution, the quiet echo of everything she had been through. Then she bent down and picked it up. Inside, there was only a single sheet of paper. And a photograph. Her hands stilled. The photograph showed a young girl. Dark hair. Bright eyes. A smile that felt strangely familiar. Margaret's breath caught. "Emma," she whispered. She hadn't seen her granddaughter in years. Not since before everything fell apart. Not since Andrew and Lily had slowly, quietly distanced themselves, until one day, even Emma had disappeared from her life. Margaret unfolded the letter. The handwriting was careful, slightly uneven.
Grandma.
"I don't know if you'll want to hear from me, but I've been thinking about you for a long time. Asterisk, I'm older now. I understand more than I did before. Asterisk. And I know what happened wasn't your fault. I would really like to see you if you're willing.
Love.
Emma." Margaret sat down slowly. The room around her faded into silence. For a long moment, she simply stared at the words. Not moving, not thinking, just feeling. Because this was something she had never allowed herself to hope for. Carefully, she picked up the photograph again. Her fingers traced the edge. Emma looked happy. Safe. That mattered more than anything. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. And in that quiet space, something gentle began to rise. Not pain, not grief. Something softer. Hope. A week later, they met. It was a small cafe. Nothing special. Just a quiet place with warm light and the soft sound of people talking in the background. Margaret arrived early.
Of course she did.
She always had. She sat near the window, her hands resting calmly around a cup of tea. For once, they didn't tremble. When the door opened, she didn't look up immediately, but something in the air shifted. And she knew. Emma stood just inside the doorway. Older now, taller, but unmistakably the same. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emma took a step forward. "Grandma," she said softly. Margaret looked up.
And smiled.
It wasn't a dramatic moment.
No tears.
No rushing forward. Just something quiet.
Real.
They sat together for a long time.
Talking.
Slowly.
Carefully.
Filling in the years that had been lost. Emma didn't ask for explanations. Margaret didn't force them. Some things didn't need to be said all at once. But one thing became clear. The story that had broken Margaret had not ended her. It had changed her. And now, sitting across from her granddaughter, listening to her speak, watching her smile, Margaret understood something she hadn't before. Loss can take everything. Trust, home, even family. But it cannot take what you rebuild. And sometimes, what returns is not what you lost. but something gentler, stronger, more honest. As they stood to leave, Emma reached for her hand, just briefly. Margaret didn't pull away. She held it. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt peaceful. Because even after betrayal, even after everything, life had given her something unexpected. A second beginning.